This commemorative was dedicated actually in June of 1988. But prior to that, there was a lot of thought, planning, and a lot of creative ideas had to be made. This morning, what I have here is I have three individuals that are really going to give you a background on how this park was created and thought of. And in our audience today, too, we have a acclaimed author, Dr. Ann Charters, who put together a lot of Kerouac's letters. So let me just open up with a quick quote out of one of Jack Kerouac's books. It's from Visions of Gerard. See if you can figure out what he's talking about. They go instead around by Kirk Street and down a railroad switch alley for the mills, across a spectral in-mine bridge street where stands the great warehouse of eternity, and into a little alley that runs between it in the stage door side entrance of B.F. Keith's Theater. What's that building of eternity? You got it right here. Well, enough of my talking. My first guest speaker is going to be Richard Scott, and he can tell you a lot about this land right here and how it came about. And Richard was one of our original members of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, another reason why we're here today.
For Maggie Cassidy, published in 1959 by Jack Kerouac. It was New Year's Eve, 1939. It was snowing in the north. The fellows were staggering down the snowy road arm in arm, supporting a central figure who all alone was singing in a cracked, sad, broken voice what he had heard the cowboys sing in Gates Theater Friday afternoon. Jack of diamonds, you'll be my downfall. But not knowing the downfall part of it, just the Jack O where it broke and yodeled in a western twang, this is G.J. Rogopoulos singing. His head hung low like a drunk's as they dragged his shoes through the snow, arms limp and hips hanging out like an idiot's in a tremendous display of didn't care attitude that had all the others struggling, slipping in the snow to hold him up. But from his broken doll neck came the plaintive notes, Jack of diamonds, as the great thick snowflakes dropped straight on our heads. It was New Year, the New Year, 1939, before the war, before anyone knew the intention of the world toward America. Those were the words I had the privilege of reading right here in this park on a sunny day on Saturday, June 25th, 1988, when this marvelous monument was dedicated. Congressional Representative Chet Atkins was the one who read after me. I think he was looking for a straight man. He said, "How come I have to follow the singer?" Well, good morning, everyone here today. What better way to start an early Saturday morning with some bad country music? Welcome to Lowell. Some might ask when the plans for this commemorative began. There are many theories on this topic. My personal theory is that the quest to create a monument to literature, albeit Lowell literature, was conceived on March 12, 1922, when Jean-Louis Debris Kerouac was born. His life was to be dedicated to and oftentimes governed by the austere Kerouac family motto, love, work, suffer. That's sort of a goth version of eat, pray, love. Perhaps it was also a send-up to Buddha's first noble truth, that existence is suffering. But somehow Jack Kerouac turned this painful, cathartic core belief into a celebration of life unlike the world had ever known. In 1987, a strange mystical convergence somehow brought together a misfit group of off-center individuals to form a committee dedicated to the planning of an event surrounding the dedication of the Jack Kerouac commemorative Eastern Canal Park. Many of you have probably never heard the name Eastern Canal Park, but yes, the park was in the process of design and construction before the commemorative was planned. The Heritage State Park in Lowell, when the state had some money there, and the city of Lowell were in partnership to create a front yard for the adaptive reuse condos and apartments right over there, the Massachusetts Mills, which was the first one built in the city. The state had undertaken this plan as a major part of redevelopment, and it involved tearing down that great gray warehouse of eternity that stood on this spot. And it was a dilapidated mill, it was a dilapidated building, and it was just sort of an eyesore here. Massachusetts Mills wanted to take it down. It was part of the project. So the saga began. The public art program was in full swing at the time, and finally the stars aligned, and Eastern Canal Park was thought to be the proper setting for the soon-to-be constructed Kerouac Commemorative. Let the games begin. Each member of our committee was extremely and personally protective of the legacy and legend of Jack Kerouac. This became obvious early on in our lively and animated discussions. That's the most diplomatic way I could put it. One of the first tasks we had to accomplish was to give a name to our upcoming extravaganza. We went round the world and back on that one. Finally, the brilliant and indomitable Roger Burnell simply stated that Kerouac celebrated Lowell with his words. There was a thought-fraught silence, and then Lowell Celebrates Kerouac appeared in the sky like Gerard's cart to heaven. The most daunting word to place in any event, and I've been involved in a lot of events in the beginning, is the word annual. Are we crazy enough to want to do this every year, like the Folk Festival, Peter? And can we convince enough other people to get on our bus and go further than we had ever thought possible? There was a resounding yes from everyone at the table. Now the devil was in the details. The event then was split into two intricate and equally important parts. First was the dedication of the commemorative itself to take place on Saturday. Second were all the peripheral events set to occur between Thursday and Sunday. It started as Friday, Saturday, then went Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then somebody said, oh, we can do this Thursday. So it just kept growing. Remember, this was June, because no one thought it was a good idea to wait until October and let the monument sit dormant, unacknowledged after its completion for 6 months. Jack Kerouac himself was christened within 7 days of his birth. Easiest decision made. I knew from my past experience that the dedication would have some political overtones simply because of the funding sources involved, as well as some diplomatic ones involving Jack's family by longevity and marriage, the Sampuses. We wanted to make the soiree in the park simple, appropriate, and respectful, and with the cast of characters involved, that was going to be quite a challenge. A number of speakers were chosen. It was consensus that most of us would read the passages from Jack's books as Ben Whitana had carved them into the polished granite stones. I read the segment from Maggie Cassidy. It was the only one with the singing part, so that was pretty cool. American Idol wasn't around at the time. And Brian Foye got to see the fruits of his labor as he raised his hand when he stood at the podium and said, we did it. All of us thought it fitting that we leave the keynote spotlight moment of the dedication to Stella Sampras Kerouac. The morning of the event came. The weather cooperated. We did not have to worry about rain, snow, sleet, or hail. You never know what to expect in New England. The city provided the stage and electricity. The state provided the sound equipment. NPS provided the sound technician and tent over the stage. A local singer-songwriter, Bob Martin, provided the pre-gala musical entertainment as the crowd gathered and began to mingle. There was a bit of a cat-and-mouse game being played there as Stella and the Sampras contingent arrived and saw Jan Kerouac, Edie Parker, Henry Crew, Allen Ginsberg, and Jerry Nicosia. These folks were not Stella's favorites. But her concern was not her personal like or dislike. Her worry was that they would take the limelight away from the true hero of the day, her husband, Jack Kerouac. On a personal note, I had the privilege of inviting Jan Kerouac to the event. She was living out west at the time. I spoke to her on the phone, and we had an immediate affinity for one another. I also found out that our birthdays are only 2 days apart. While she was here, she came to a dinner party at my mother's house. And who was there? Brad Parker, Jerry Nicosia, Robin Moore, Ann Charters. And they thoroughly enjoyed the family atmosphere and enjoyed even more, like everyone else, my mother's incredible apple pie. She was able to read from her dad's works at a panel discussion held at Liberty Hall that night, despite her failing eyesight. She has since passed away, but she always said that being in Lowell for the dedication and the other events was an experience she'd never forget. So picture this. Edie Parker, Jack's first wife, is there. Jan Kerouac, Jack's daughter from his second wife, Joan Haverty, is there. Like living chess pieces out of Alice in Wonderland, they moved about the commemorative in stealth-like hide-and-seek mode. Allen Ginsberg, in true Allen fashion, tried a few times to sneak up on the stage like a bad adolescent trying to be noticed. It was all part of what I still refer to as the mystical, fanciful, urban street theater that is Lowell. It was fitting that some kind of drama play itself out at the event on this hallowed ground, commemorating one of the most controversial writers of all time. Finally, the speakers and dignitaries gathered on the dais and one by one took the podium to read the words as they appeared on the commemorative. Reverend Lionel Willett gave the invocation, Paul Songa sat next to Stella, and a picture of Jack graced the stage. The final speaker was Stella, whose raw emotion cut through the crowd like a knife. She knew it had been a hard-fought battle to get this fitting and proper monument built, celebrating the works of her husband, as his work celebrated the city he loved so dearly. It was the only place he ever truly called home. Stella spoke so proudly that day of being the wife of a great writer. Her words, her sincerity, her demeanor, her profound honesty finally hushed the critics and naysayers who had tried to derail this project so many times. She concluded so eloquently by loudly professing that my husband Jack Kerouac's words flow through this monument like the Merrimack River flows throughout his beloved city of Lowell. The sun shone down on us, the water in Eastern Canal sparkled like never before, and with each syllable uttered, Jack's spirit became more alive and more visible to all who attended. This was his day, the one he had hoped for deep in the catacombs of his soul. In his latter days, he was his usual private, brooding self, but an enigma, not only not wanting to be asked the meaning of life, but also not wanting not to be recognized for the influential and prolific author he was. He had said earlier in life that if a statue of him was to be created like that of Balzac, he would pose naked for it. Well, he didn't have the opportunity to do that, but he did get to bear his heart, mind, and most intimate thoughts through his magnificent words, literally etched in stone for all to read, absorb, and imbibe. There's a book published in 2007 by Edie Frankie Parker entitled You'll Be Okay. Near the end of the book, Edie describes her version of the events of that day in June 1988. Before long, the official celebrants began to fill the dais. Alan was there, as well as Stella Sampas, Kerouac, Jack's widow, along with all the local and state politicians who until that moment had disavowed Jack's ties to Lowell. They thought of him as a drunkard, and the town might be better off if they forgot about him entirely. The ceremony was all very dignified and stiff, and throughout it, most of the crowd and media attention was focused on Henry and Edie. Now, you got to remember, Edie's the one writing this book, who ignored the official speeches. When it was all over, the crowds began to disperse. I overheard someone telling Ferlinghetti about a party being thrown at one of the hotels for the guests. I went over to Edie and told her that we should go and said, well, I don't know, maybe nobody wants us to go. We didn't get invited. Henry wheeled his way over after giving an interview to the reporter from the Lowell Sun newspaper. We told him what was going on and asked what he thought we should do. Just then, out of nowhere, a woman approached, extending her hand and smiling. She was having a few people over to her house and asked if we would come there for beer and pizza. Henry didn't hesitate. Beer and pizza? We'd love to. The one who invited Henry Crew and Edie and a bunch of others was Bob Martin and his wife Anne Marie, who lived over in Centerville at the time. So he actually knew Jack from, he lived on Stephen Street when Jack had lived there later on in his life. I first heard about Jack Kerouac from my dad, who knew him through his football days at Lowell High. My father, the quintessential Lowell guy, gave me a copy of On the Road, which I read when I was 12 and was quite intrigued by the style, speed, and flow of the prose. I was hooked at that point. I was lucky enough to be supervised with the Heritage State Park in Lowell during an incredibly creative time. I still consider my role in the dedication of the commemorative and the creation of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac as the most humbling and successful moment of my 32 career with the Massachusetts State Parks. Events of this nature are not about the planners or the politicians. They are the sole property of those to whom they are dedicated. It is the legacy of individuals like Jack Kerouac kept alive that we can all share in, revel in, due to the generosity of their creative endeavors. Since this year is the 60th anniversary of the publication of Dharma Bums, I'd like to conclude my remarks with one of my favorite passages. In fact, it was when I was doing the walking tours, I would always finish by reading it right here. Pay close attention to the last lines of this. It's a really good philosophy of life right at the end. Then would come wild, lyrical, drizzling rain from the south. in the wind. And I'd say, taste the rain. Why kneel? And I'd say, time for hot coffee and cigarette, boys, addressing the imaginary bhikkhus. The moon was full and huge, and with it came the aurora borealis over Mount Hosamine. Look at the void, it is even stiller, Han San had said in Jaffe's translation. And in fact, I was so still, all I had to do was shift my crossed legs in the alpine grass, and I could hear the hoofs of deers running away somewhere. Standing on my head before bedtime on the rock roof of the moonlight, I could indeed see that the earth was truly upside down, and man, a weird, vain beetle full of strange ideas, walking around upside down and boasting. And all I could realize that man remembered why this dream of plants and planets and Plantagenets was built out of primordial essence. Sometimes I'd get mad because things didn't work out well. I'd spoil a flapjack or slip in a snowfield while getting water, or one of my times my shovel went sailing down into the gorge. I'd be so mad I'd want to bite the mountaintops and would come back to the shack, kick the cupboard, and hurt my toe. But let the mind beware, though the flesh be bugged, the circumstances of existence are pretty glorious. Thanks for the privilege of speaking here today after 30 years. Many of us are still vertical, so that's good. And I really appreciate it. This is a great turnout this morning. Enjoy the rest of today and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you.
You know, last night I was wondering what kind of Kerouac fan, after a Friday night together in Lowell, would be able to get up at 9 a.m. to be here. So I'm really impressed. You're really the Kerouac hardcore fan club, if ever there was one. Anyway, my background, I come at all of this from a different perspective. I'm a public administrator. I ran the Lowell Historic Preservation Commission, which was a federal commission that existed from 1978 to 1995. It was meant to be temporary and was meant to do things, make physical improvements in Lowell to augment the national park. So we were working with owners of historic buildings to get the buildings renovated to a higher standard, to set the standard for how historic preservation should be done. We created, you're hearing the trolley go by, we actually had the trolleys built, acquired the track and upgraded the track so the trolleys could operate in Lowell. We envisioned a series of canal walkways. Like you see here, the canalway system here is something that we put together. So there were a lot of, and there was a public art element and a lot of cultural programming. So the commission had a number of well-known local Franco-Americans involved. Armin Mercier, who later became a city councilor, Armin LeMay, who had been a city councilor and was for a while chairman of the commission, the federal commission, and of course Paul Marion, who was a staff person. He was the director of cultural affairs. I was the executive director, and we worked together very closely. What Paul reminded me is that the original idea for honoring Kerouac was going to be a plaque over on Central Street, the walkway by, for those of you who know it, the Trio condos. So if you're at the Central Street Bridge and you look down at the hotel, the other way, up the canal. And there was just going to be some sort of plaque or something like that. In the course of things, it became apparent that this area was going to become a park. And that opportunity opened up the potential, and various people had brought forward the idea that this should be where the Kerouac commemorative should be. So what was here at the time was a 9-story concrete warehouse. And as someone involved with the demolition of that warehouse, I can tell you it was built to last. There was a hope to develop the Massachusetts mills. There was a hope to renovate what was called the Cirque building over here. Locally it was called the Surf Hotel And then the Bridge Street boarding house was decrepit, and there was a desire to see that renovated. So, and there was really a feeling that the warehouse had low floor-to-ceiling heights, maybe 6-7 feet, because the things that would be put in the warehouse, like if cotton went into that warehouse, you'd push it forward, so you didn't need height. Nobody was lifting up the cotton to put it up high. So it had become a storage, container storage place. So you could go in and rent a cubicle and have your storage there. Over at City Hall, the staff in the planning department designed a landscape here, an idea for a landscape. And so we did a little pilgrimage into Boston. So as the city manager and the planning and development director and myself from the Preservation Commission, there were a number of folks, and I think Paul Songus might have been there. I can't remember, to tell you the truth. And we met with a guy named Frank Keefe. Now, those of you who have been around Lowell a real long time, back to the Pat Mogan days, might remember that Frank Keefe was the city planner for Lowell. So he was somebody who picked up this idea of creating a national park and a lot of the ideas that Pat Mogan was espousing. But he had moved on, and in the Dukakis administration had held several high-level positions. So he was Secretary of Administration and Finance in the Dukakis administration at the time this idea for the park came up. And I don't know if you can comprehend that the guy who controls the purse string at the state level is a big deal. So even though the money was Heritage State Park money that was being proposed for this, Frank Keefe had no hesitation at all to commit this money without talking to DEM, Department of Environmental Management, right in the program, which I always thought was a little unusual. So we all went in with a plan. It was literally one piece of paper and a few numbers, and the numbers added up to $3 million. And Frank Keefe said, I know that building. When I was planner in Lowell, I went in that building. That's terrible. Nothing's ever going to, you can't redevelop that. Nothing's ever going to be done there. So he said, absolutely, consider this approved, and I'll get it down, let the agency know, etc. And we're going, this is nice. So many of you know of the name Joe Tully. Joe Tully was the city manager, and Joe was a little rough around the edges. Let's just keep it general. The people who know are laughing hardest. So Joe literally leaned over the table with a pen and crossed out the 3 million and wrote in 3.5. He says, if you're going to be that agreeable, let's do it right. So we picked up another $500,000. And believe it or not, back in those days, they would never do this today. Within a month or two, they had sent us a check for $3.5 million, sent the city a check for Now you don't, you have to wait for reimbursement and all that kind of stuff. So the city acquired the warehouse by eminent domain. 200 warehouse tenants had to be relocated, no small feat. The thing had to be demolished. Well, let me tell you, out of $3.5 million, that was a big, big chunk of it. There really wasn't that much more money for, a park. So the park was very much grass, a walkway or two, some small trees, and again, putting in the railing along the edge there. So that was pretty much it. So that's when we got into the discussion that, hey, you get this great location, and, couldn't something more be done to make it enticing and attractive? And the whole thinking about the Kerouac and the suggestions came from various sources, moving the Kerouac commemorative over here. And then we turned to another committee chaired by Paul Songus, which was the Lowell Public Art Committee. And the Lowell Public Art Committee was bringing in national artists to Lowell and having them spend a week here to get immersed in the town and to have the planners show them various locations around town where art might be appropriate, with the idea that the artist would choose the location. They were against the idea of plop art, where you just say, this is the spot, you can put something there. They said, no, the artists need to gravitate. So Ben Waitena, from San Antonio, Texas, was one of the artists invited up here. There were a number of artists, and they were looking at a number of locations, and Ben gravitated to the Jack Kerouac topic and also to this site. And of course, the city had already had Brown and Rowe landscape architects involved. You know, as I'm standing here, I'm looking out behind you. Look at this tree right behind you. There was no tree. There were no trees. This was a warehouse. Okay. So the fact that these trees in 30 years are here is just amazing. Well, we had another problem. We wanted to give the money for the public art related to Kerouac to the city because it's the city's park. So the city had to enter the deal and get it done. Well, that meant that the city council needed a vote to accept the funds from the federal government. It was $100,000 to fund the sculpture. And it also meant, because it was a grant to the city, that it needed to be signed off on by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, who at the time was Donald Hodel, this is 1987-88, in the Reagan administration. So the issue comes before the city council, and sure enough, one councilor, and some of you remember Brendan Fleming, and Brendan was indignant that the drunk was going to get a statue, okay, because that's what everybody envisioned, was a statue of Jack Kerouac. I don't know what the pose would be, but anyway. So this set off quite the debate. The council vote was favorable. They accepted the money, and we sent the message up to the Secretary of the Interior, and he's signed off on the grant. So Jack got, official endorsement from the City Council and the Secretary of the Interior in the Reagan administration. So that's quite a thing. And I recall the San Francisco Times running a story about Brendan Fleming and his opposition to to Jack Kerouac being honored in Lowell. So, I mean, that's how far it went. But that leads us to the words on the sculpture. Just because the sculptor and others came up with the idea of representing Jack in writing, it's not him, it's not his face, it's not a bust, it's not a statue, it's his words that were being memorialized here. It became apparent that they needed to get literary rights to use the words, and I seem to remember it was Houghton Mifflin who had had published. So Paul Marion of our staff communicated with Houghton Mifflin, and they said, "Oh, you need to talk to Stella Kerouac. She's down in St. Petersburg, Florida." So Paul started sending letters to St. Petersburg, Florida, and we were getting no response. So one day, when Paul wasn't in the office, I was, and my secretary came in and said, "Stella Kerouac is here to see you." I thought, well, this is going to be interesting, and it was. So John Sampas brought in Stella Kerouac, and they came and sat in my office, and I described what was going on with the park, and I described the public art process, and I described what we'd like to do for Jack. And they took it all in, and I said, "By the way, we have a model of this park." I said, "Let me go get it." So I go out to our outer office, no model. I said, "Where the hell is the model? I want to show it to them right now and hopefully we can get this approval." And they said, "Oh, the model's over in the city manager's office." I said, "Okay." So I call over the city manager's office. "Can we come over? I got Stella Kerouac here. Can we come over and see the model because we need her sign off on the words?" And so we walked over to City Hall. We went up into the city manager's office, and there was the model. And later on, when we got the approval, and it was probably John Sampas who told us later on that what impressed her was that the model was in the city manager's office. That it was like like it wasn't just some crazy artsy Kerouac aficionados who wanted to do this commemorative, but that the city had appreciated it enough and was behind it enough that the model was over there and being shown in a favorable way. So Stella did sign off on the words, so it's all legit, folks. And then off we went to the races. The construction was tough because when the building was demolished, there was a lot of debris left under the ground. So now, as you tried to do a paved surface, a lot of stuff had to be excavated. So there's like a second phase of excavation. There's a lot of nasty stuff that goes on in the demolition construction end of things. But we got the mandala design to represent the Buddhism related to, it looks like a cross, so it relates to the Catholicism. It was a chance to really augment what this park would be about. So this commemorative is a plus for the community, I think. This park would have been very bland without it. But also, it's so great to have you all here. And I think we're all so proud to have this commemorative and to have the recognition of this native son here in Lowell. And I'm glad from the Preservation Commission in that I could be a part of it. It wasn't a pretty process to get it here, but here it is. And thank you all for coming out this early morning to hear about this.
My next speaker is Brian Foye, and Brian is a big reason why we're here. He is one of the original founders of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, and he's home visiting Lowell in October from Louisville, Kentucky.
I really do want to thank Peter, Richard Scott, Paul Marion. Mike Worm is here. Mike was heavily influential. It was a really amazing partnership between the state and the city and the federal agencies. I think at one point, Peter, there was the Coast Guard was involved because we were close enough to a waterway. So like they had to sign off at one point. I see Jim. I want to thank Stella, and also Stella's brother Tony was a big inspiration for any of us that were here in Lowell. I see Mr. Amram. I told him once this is a blue collar festival, and he's been back ever since. But Tony was a big inspiration for us. That not just that would go and have a Boilermaker at Nicky's at 11 o'clock at night. It was really the first time I was in Lowell with Allen Ginsberg, we bumped into Tony, and the respect that Allen had for Tony and Tony had for Allen was so genuine, and it was really good to see, and it kept us inspired. So I want to thank, again, all those agencies and all those people involved. In January of 1986, about 2 years and 6 months before the monument was built, I was in New York City. I was living in Lowell at the time. I went to New York City. I went to an exhibit of Allen Ginsberg's photographs at the Holly Solomon Gallery and met Allen Ginsberg, and he said, you're from Lowell. It's ridiculous they don't have a park. They don't have a monument to Jack Kerouac in Lowell. You need to go back there and do something about it. And it was like this urgency. I know Dr. Charters knows how Allen would talk sometimes. It was this real urgency about it. So we came back to Lowell, and I talked to a few of the different, Mr. Topier and some other people around the city, and they said, go see Jimmy Curtis, who was Jack Kerouac's lawyer when he was in Lowell. So I went to see Mr. Curtis, and he said, here, these are the incorporation papers of the Hellenic American Club. Just replace the words Hellenic American with Kerouac and retype it. I said, all right, I can do that. But Mr. Curtis also told me that Jack Kerouac would come into his office after every time an episode of, what was that old show, Sunset Strip? He said every time, after every episode, Route 66, there was like some show on TV, and he said after every episode, Kerouac would come in with like a 15-page, single-space typed legal brief in impeccably written legal terminology, suing the makers and describing exactly where in his books the show had. And so Jimmy still had all of these large pieces. So we started a nonprofit. It was called the Corporation for the Celebration of Jack Kerouac in Lowell, and it was doing business as Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. It was sort of the fun of it was just to do something in Lowell and to do something interesting and to kind of recognize Jack Kerouac in Lowell. But really, for those of us that were here in Lowell, it was more about like, what the hell, there's nothing to do here. Like, let's do something fun. Let's do something kind of interesting. And I want to come back. So it was do something fun, do something interesting. We started this nonprofit. We realized we didn't have, there wasn't a lot of credibility at the time. So we talked to authors all around the country. John Updike, who was in Beverly Farms or Manchester by the Sea or some kind of posh place, he agreed to come to Lowell and do a reading. And I think that for those that remember John Updike's reading, I think that sort of would really elevate our group in those early days. A side note about John Updike, he and I drove back from the reading to there was a party afterwards that, it was probably like $20 at the time. We thought it was a ton of money, and we got a lot of affluent people in Lowell to pay for a party with John Updike, and he was real good about it. A real specific point I have to make about the park and the monument and the festival, and that it was really Allen Ginsberg who was a driving force behind it, back to my first point. It wouldn't be here without Kerouac, but it wasn't until Allen came to Lowell in March of 1986, 2 years before the park was built, and again drummed up the interest. And it was at that time there was not a ton of Kerouac available to us. There were the editions, and there were the 16, 17, 18 books. There were not, of course, Dr. Charters collected letters. There was not the sense that there was as much more that was there. There was an understanding that there was some of it, but there wasn't that understanding. And it wasn't until, and so we thought, well, we had this sort of really hip, cool writer. Dennis McNally, the road manager of the Grateful Dead, he called me up. He was also a really good friend of Tony Sampas's. He called me up first, said, hey, how's Tony? Do you see Tony around? I said, yeah. He said, hey, I'm in a hotel room with the Grateful Dead. Like, and you're on speakerphone. Like, is it really true you're going to build a park? And I said, yeah, why don't you guys come to Lowell? and it was, Bob says, man, you have no idea what one of our shows is like. And then Dennis gets back on. He's like, that's a whole nother level of operation here to go. But it was a really fun, exciting time. Back to the point, there wasn't that kind of the generosity of materials there yet with Kerouac. And so we were kind of pecking around the edges, thinking he was a certain kind of a writer. It was Allen who came in and said, you don't understand. This is like the most important American writer. It is the writer whose imagination exceeds every other American writer's. The imagination was fueled here in Lowell, and it was fired here in Lowell, and it kept returning to Lowell. And it's not that that's the achievement, it's the first part of that we're talking about really the most imaginative American writer ever, who you will start to see the materials emerge that will continue to reinforce this idea that nobody took their space and used their imagination to transform the way that we see that very same space. And I think it was Allen that, in fact, then came and opened up the city. So, assuming how little I know about technology this works, I'd like to share a little bit of Allen, who came here to Lowell on St. Patrick's Day, 1986, and Richard Scott was there, many others were there, and then in the auditorium brought out his harmonium and created a spontaneous song right on the spot.
Happy to be here in Lowell. Today, the 17th of March. Couple more days, it'll be springtime. The weather won't be so harsh. Now, my job is to welcome myself and yourself and all visitors here today. So I hope our minds will be harmonious and won't clash. Jack Kerouac came from your hometown. I visited him once here. But I know Lowell, Massachusetts inside my brain really dear. Because I read all of Kerouac's prose, walking the streets I have nothing to fear. He wrote about you all and the streets spontaneously, out of the bottom of his mind. He told everybody that they could do it too. That's why I'm sitting here singing to you blind. I don't know what I'm going to say next, but it must be something on top of my own kind. Certainly Kerouac was a genius, and geniuses are not recognized at home. I think I said that to the Lowell Sun, and I'm glad they wrote it out for you to read and get it under your dome. What I said more precisely to the reporter was that in China, Kerouac is considered an excellent specialist Americanist, prose writer, certainly a generationist who applies not only to the Americans but also to the Chinese too, after the Cultural Revolution when they came back from exile to go home. The thing that was important about Kerouac was he told everybody to speak his ultimate mind. He said, everybody's mind is bottomless, just like the universe, and like the universe quite kind. Because it took 4 billion years to evolve your brain. And if you don't believe in evolution, then you gotta agree that God made your brain. And if you think of it that way, that certainly would blow your mind. So now we're gathered here in the spirit of Jack Kerouac's lamb. Certainly the most tearful Lowell citizen, continually weeping over that I am that I am. Certainly the most memorial Lowellian, knowing he was going to die, just like any old clam. Therefore his heart broke seeing his brother Gerard die, seeing his father die too. He experienced death in Lowell, and he knew it would come to me and to you. Therefore he decided that art was the one eternal glue. Now, though he was considered a sad case by the local drunks who drank him under the table, he did one thing that none of them ever were even to conceive be able. He wrote numerous books, 21, 22, 23, some unpublished as yet, some still sitting under the table. In his books, he described the life of his mind and the life of his boyfriends and girls, described the lives and deaths of his families, how into gray the hairs turned on all their golden curls, described how love in the springtime seemed sweet, but your winter's absence has been more than anyone except the black flag of death could happily unfurl. So now that I've said some little bit about first thought, best thought, spontaneous brain, I'll leave it up to the high school poets of Lowell to read Jack's prose with pleasure or with pain. And I'll get off the stage and return with Gregory Corso if he shows up to the front door, because he went out walking before. So I'll be back later. What was the rhyme? Here? Up here on the stage once more.
By 1994, I had been in the Army with someone named John Late. Some of you, I shouldn't say old timers, since I'm an old timer myself, technically. But John was from Lowell, and we were in the Army together in 1952. And he always said, "You gotta come to Lowell someday, Dave." And when I finally came here, I never realized John knew Jack Kerouac. And he mentioned that when he was a teenager, in the late 40s that Jack used to come back to visit town. And these were young kids, 15 years old, trying to learn how to play music and reading out of a little fake book. And the one person who came into this little bar was this man named Jack Kerouac, whom everyone in town remembered as being a great football player in high school. And he said Jack was the only person that he ever met during that time that would come up to the band of all these little kids trying to learn, say, "Fellas, you sounded good." Jack always was that way. When I met him 56 years later, he was someone who fostered creativity in others. And he also didn't speak English till he was 6 years old. And he used to say, "I write in English, but I dream in French." So pour tous mes amis qui viennent de Québec, bienvenue ici dans la ville de Lowell. Nous sommes très heureux pour être ici avec nous. That means for all our friends in Quebec to be welcome, because Jack spoke and loved his French heritage. And he loved the fact that Lowell has always been a city where people came from all over the world to find a home here in the United States. And if you were at the high school poetry contest yesterday, most of the kids now who go there, their families don't speak English or are just starting to. And here were 60 kids writing their own fantastic poetry. And that's the wonderful heritage that Jack gave everyone, all of us who were blessed to know him, and all those who were blessed to read these beautiful words etched in stone. He fostered creativity in others. So when Brian Foye said to me, "Dave, Lowell is a blue collar," I'm pronouncing it correctly, a blue collar event, I said, man, life is a blue collar event. And when I did a symphony piece for James Galway, the great Irish flute player, I said, you know, Sir James, because he was made a sir, knighted by the Queen, I said, you know, you act so beautifully. The second movement had à la Claire Fontaine and another beautiful folk song that Jack used to sing at 3 o'clock in the morning when we were wandering around. And I said, you know, Jack would have loved you, Sir Jimmy, because every single person who crosses your path, you're like him. You're respectful to, and you encourage, you're nice to every young musician, anybody. And he said, Dave, he said, where I'm from in Northern Ireland, we don't endorse putting on airs. So I want to mention that to all of you. If Jack was misunderstood by the New York literary establishment when he suddenly became a world-famous author overnight and wouldn't take that role of being Mr. Snobitissimo with a nervous breakdown, a psychiatrist, tweed coat with patches on the sleeve, and a writer's block, he was the same wonderful cat he was when I met him in 1956 at a Bring Your Own Bottle party. He was always genuine, soulful, and warm to every person who crossed his path. Set a great example for all of us how to behave that knew him, and for all the young folks now who want to be writers, authors, painters, airline pilots, whatever you want to do, that Lowell soul and that human thing was there. And I just wanted to play a little tune we used to do at the Bring Your Own Bottle parties. And Jack was a classicist, a great intellectual. Oh, he would never say that. And when they showed his beautiful scroll in London, England, I was invited right where the King George Library is, the original scripts of Shakespeare and Beowulf and Emily Bronte and all these people. There was Jack's words sitting right there, right next to theirs, just where he belonged. And I said, you could imagine someone from Lowell, Massachusetts, didn't even speak English till he was 6, having his work with these great writers. And I said, he could recite all that stuff from memory of Beowulf and Chaucer. We didn't even understand what they were, so he translated it for us. He knew all that, and he knew what we see here. And what more beautiful way for everybody here that to have your works put in stone. That's really about the hippest thing that can happen. So for the memory of Jack, and thanks to the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Committee, little tune we used to do at the Bring Your Own Bottle parties till they threw us out. Little theme and variations on Amazing Grace by another great person, Captain John Smith, who wrote this beautiful song.